Welcome back. So before we continue with our video tutorial series about Azure DNS Private Resolver, so let's have a quick recap on what we have configured so far or deployed in Azure. So we have configured a virtual network, one for our hub virtual network and the other for our spoke virtual network. So the hub virtual network will be the virtual network as to where our virtual network gateway in the future subnet and our private DNS inbound endpoint. So the private DNS resolver inbound endpoint, and you have also the outbound endpoint subnet. We have also created the virtual network for our spoke virtual network. So here it will be for our future virtual machine that it will house the subnet for that. So we have a single subnet for that virtual machine. And then if we go back to our virtual network for our hub, if we scroll down under peerings, we also configured peering from hub to spoke. So as you could see, there's already a peering configured and it's connected. And if you go back to the VNet spoke, it will also reflect the connection from spoke to our virtual network for our hub. So we have peer spoke 01 to hub, which is also fully synchronized and connected. And finally, for simplicity, rather than have a real on-prem network, so we will have our on-prem network as a virtual network in Azure also, so to stand in as our on-prem network. So we have created the virtual network for the on-prem with the address space, and it will also have the subnets for virtual network gateway and for the future server subnet in our on-prem. So if we revisit our diagram, so we have configured the virtual network in our on-prem. We have also configured the virtual network in our hub, and we have also a single spoke VNet. So next on the agenda is to create an Azure private DNS zone, and we will key in this particular zone on cloud.inquirinity.com, and we will also configure the virtual network links, so on our hub VNet and to our spoke VNet. As for our on-premises environment, but actually in Azure, so a separate virtual network, so since we will configure or deploy a virtual machine that will have the domain controller and DNS server roles, so we will not create the private DNS zone. So let's see if this can stand in for that DNS zone for record for this on-prem.inquirinity.com. So in essence, so this particular part of this video tutorial series will be quite short, as we will only configure the private DNS zone and the virtual network links. And thereafter, we will configure on another part of this video tutorial series the virtual machines that are needed on the spoke VNet and as well as the on-premises environment. It is highly recommended to visit the official documentation for Microsoft, and in particular the Azure, and in particular for our video tutorial series, the Azure private DNS resolver. But for our part in this particular video is the private DNS zone. So this will give you the overview of what is this particular private DNS zone. So it gives you that description that it provides reliable, secure DNS service to manage and resolve domain names in a virtual network without the need to add a custom DNS solution. So if we scroll down, you will see the limits. So how many private DNS zones, how many virtual network links per private DNS zone, for example. Of course, we will not be able to reach this because this is only a demonstration. And we will also have these restrictions. So single label is not supported. So your DNS zone must have 2 or more labels. So for example, contoso.com has 2 labels. separated by a dot. And a private DNS zone can have a maximum of 34 labels. So I don't think we will able to reach that also, that maximum of 34 labels. So these are the reserve zone names that we won't be able to use because they are obviously reserved for Azure and Microsoft purposes. So that's why we are using inquiry.com for our demonstration. We'll come back later to this documentation once we configured or deployed our private DNS zone, especially if we will be configuring the virtual network links and the auto registration. So back in our resource group, so for us to proceed to create the private DNS zone, so let's click create. And let's wait for it to load. We are in this marketplace and we just simply type private DNS zone. Okay, so it's here. Let's close these AI suggestions. So we have some options here. So private DNS zone is what we are looking for. It's an Azure service. And let's click the create private DNS zone. So we have some tabs here: basics, the private DNS zone editor, the virtual network links, the tags, and finally review and create. So under basics, so we have the subscription, we have the resource group already here, and for our instance, so the resource group location now have that region Southeast Asia. So let's say on cloud.inquirinity.com review and create, but let's just proceed first. So private DNS zone editor, so we can upload our DNS zone file. For our case we don't have, and we can edit here, so we don't have. So virtual network links, we could create or add the virtual network link now, or we could add the virtual network link later. I think for the time being, let's just proceed and let's add, so to put more emphasis on the virtual network link creation or configuration later. So for now, let's create the private DNS zone first. So tags, okay, so you can put in the tags. So review and create, and it will do a validation if it's successful. Once the validation is okay, then we can click create. Let's scroll. So subscription, resource group, the location, the name, okay, the spelling is okay. Record sets we don't have yet. We know that we don't have any virtual network links yet, so that's okay, we could create it later. So let's click create, and it will initialize the deployment, and in due time it will be deployed, and we could see that private DNS zone resource. So it's accepted, and it's just waiting for it to be completed. Alright, after a moment of waiting, it says your deployment is complete. It also has this notification, deployment succeeded. This particular deployment is succeeded, and let's just go to the resource to check if our private DNS zone is indeed there. So it has, and it has a one record set and virtual network links with the 0 virtual network links. Okay, let's take a look at our private DNS zone. So for us, the DNS management blade or setting is the one appropriate to visit to. So it has two menus here, so record sets and virtual network links. So we have one record set. Let's take a look. What is it? So it's the SOA, okay, start of authority, and it's from here that we could add the record. So if you're familiar with DNS, so you have this DNS record type of A record, quad A's for IPv6, CNAME, your MX mail exchange records, your service records, your TXT, and your pointer records. Okay, so this is where you type in if you'll have to create a new DNS record, but we won't be doing that because we will later on configure the auto registration here in our virtual network link. So if we go back to our Microsoft or official Microsoft documentation on Azure Private DNS Zone and under the virtual network links, so we will know that a virtual network link is the link or connection between the zone or the private DNS zone that we have just created and the virtual network that are on our Azure. So remember, we have two in Azure, so hub or the virtual machine. We could also configure the virtual network connection only to the spoke VM or the spoke VNet. So we could also do that. So you have the option also to enable the auto registration. So when this setting is enabled, the virtual network becomes a registration virtual network for the private DNS zone. So further, if we click on this auto registration link, and it gives us the idea how to enable it by simply doing the check under configuration. It will also mention here that the auto registration works only for virtual machines. So for all other resources like internal load balancers, you can create DNS records manually in the private DNS zone. So in reality, okay, since it will only work for virtual machines, we could revisit our diagram wherein only the spoke VM or the spoke VNet will be having that virtual network link. So this is the diagram that we could revisit. So we have this virtual network link here from this hub VNet. We have the spoke VNet, and you have the another spoke VNet in the future. So if there's no virtual machine here, so we could leave this one in the future first and only configure the virtual network link auto registration enabled on the spoke VNet. So back here in our Azure portal, so we are here at record sets previously. So let's go and click in the virtual network links, and of course there's no virtual network links because we didn't create or add during the creation of the private DNS zone. So there's a handy add here, and we could add in the virtual network link. So creating or adding a virtual network link is quite straightforward. So it just requires a link name, then just to select what the subscription and the virtual network. So let's start first with the virtual network so that I could name it properly. So for example, in our virtual network, we will only select the spoke 01 Azure. So that will also give me, let's say I will put in VNL just for the virtual network link hyphen, then the VNet, and let's have it spoke 01 Azure. So spoke 01 Azure. So it accepts. And configuration, so there's this auto registration under the configuration to enable. There's nothing else. Okay, so let's click check and we are good to go. So just verify or review, and if it's the correct one, then click create. Alright, our virtual network link to our VNet spoke 01 Azure is already created, but the link's status is still in progress. So we have here the notification that the creation of the virtual network link was successful. The auto registration for this virtual network link is enabled, and we could also have this edit here, and we could either uncheck or obviously delete, which we don't want. Just click discard, and let's continue on our future videos or the next video for this Azure Private DNS Resolver video tutorial series. So we have the link status now completed. So we have also this setting fallback to internet. So before we end our video tutorial for this part, So what does this mean? So if we go back to the official Microsoft documentation on Azure Private DNS, so we have fallback to internet resolution. So it will enable, so if we enable it, it will enable fallback to internet recursion when an authoritative NX domain response, NX domain is also known as negative response, is received for a private link zone. So it will go and do a fallback to internet recursion and look for the record for that particular domain. What's next soon is after we provision a virtual machine. So since we have the auto registration enabled in this virtual network, so if we have a virtual machine under this virtual network, so by right, if we go to record sets, we should see additional record here. So for now, there's only one, which is the SOA record. So that's it for this part of this video tutorial series. So we now have additional Azure resource. So it is a global resource. So unlike our virtual network, which is a regional resource, Southeast Asia, for example. So we now have the private DNS zone on cloud.inquirinity.com. So stay tuned for the rest of the videos or part of this video tutorial series about Azure DNS Private Resolver. Thank you for watching.